Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our second workshop of International Survey Methods of the fall semester. Thank you all for being here. And please join me in welcoming our speaker, Professor Consuelo Amat from the Department of Political Science at John Hopkins University. Her research includes the study of state repression and political violence in authoritarian regimes. And today, Consuelo is going to give us a very interesting talk on a meta-analysis across different countries. So, Consuelo, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me, Robert, and for organizing, and it's really a pleasure to be here. This is the first time that I actually present the beginnings of a meta-analysis. We have done analysis of all the separate countries, but it's the first time that I attempt to kind of talk about meta-analyses, and it's definitely not, at the stage where I would like it to be for the presentation, but it's okay. I look forward to your feedback. So this work is co-authored with Jonathan Pinkney, who's a colleague at the University of Texas, Dallas. And it's titled, Does Training Activists in Nonviolent Action Work? And we have evidence from field experiments in Sudan, Tunisia, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. So there's a couple of motivations for this project. The first one is the dual trends that we see in rising authoritarianism and repression, and the number of protests, especially maximalist protests. So we see that in the past decade or so, the number of nonviolent action campaigns onsets has dramatically increased. On the other hand, the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance in these maximalist campaigns, meaning center-seeking campaigns or secessionist campaigns, so they're not nonviolent action campaigns that are for reforms, but they're actually for removing, overthrowing a regime or seceding. The success rate of those nonviolent action campaigns has dramatically decreased during the same period of time. And then the second motivation is that democracy promoting interventions that we see from the international community, international governmental organizations, international governmental organizations like the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, Canvas, RISE, the U.S. Institute of Peace before it was doged, and the Albert Einstein Institution and the Leading Change Network. All of these organizations and many, many others focus on training activists to build the capacity of civil society as a way to promote democracy. And it is the kind of capacity building trainings is the number one, the most common form of democracy promoting intervention that we see in the world. However, we have very few studies that actually have looked at examined the causal effect of these trainings on the people who were trained and on their movements. Most of the studies that we have not have experimental designs and just focus on kind of a pre and post survey. So the research questions that are part of this whole project are, do capacity building interventions for grassroots leaders work? And number two is, what is the effect of training community leaders in strategic nonviolent action and peace building? So we have, the theoretical framework that we're using is I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but it basically comes from this basic idea that we think that armed action requires a lot of training to be effective. So soldiers need a lot of training to be effective combatants in war. And just as they do, nonviolent action activists require a lot of training as well to be effective in nonviolent resistance. It's not something that we're born understanding how it works, how nonviolent action works, and how people power works, right? And so we have observed in the work that we have done that activists and peace builders kind of lack a few areas of understanding in particular. So number one is there seems to be, on the one hand, activists that work with very contentious tactics like protest. And there are, on the other hand, peace builders who focus mainly on understanding and through dialogue and negotiation. But very few movements actually merge these two populations, the peace builders with the activists, and they don't talk to each other and they don't learn from each other. But we think that the most effective movements merge the two and understand when you need to do contentious politics to build power right? And to create kind of a crisis, a constructive crisis to solve something and to create power of the people. On the other hand, when you need to use negotiation with your opponent and even dialogues to build more alliances and coalitions within your own movement. The second thing that we've observed that activists generally lack is that there's very little strategic planning and conflict analysis that goes into some of the campaigns. Especially, I think this is particularly important now, given the rise in the number of protest movements that we partially attributed to, so scholars have partially attributed to the fact that social media makes it so easy to bring hundreds of thousands of people to the streets. But there isn't a lot of kind of organizational infrastructure behind those mobilizations that, as a result, makes them less effective. And so what we see is that a lot of people just go and protest, do the first thing that they're have a grievance, and then they go and protest as a way to express those grievances. But there's a very little like kind of strategic planning and conflict analysis that goes behind that. And we know from research that strategic planning is very important for success. The third thing that we've observed is that the understanding of power that comes from nonviolent resistance is very different than the understanding of power that comes from kind of military power. It's more about relational power, and that it's you can't really define power without knowing who you're up against, right? The opponent, and all of these things are very fluid. And so there's a lot of, the work that Gene Sharp has done, NEPSTAD, but also even just fundamentally how Gandhi understood people power is really something that activists don't have a major understanding of, and so they can't leverage it to the full extent. The fourth thing is that trainings potentially can provide a lot of historical examples to activists and peace builders that they might not be aware of bringing examples of different contexts of successful and failed nonviolent action campaigns that could improve their understanding of the practice of nonviolent resistance and what has worked and what hasn't worked, and how that may apply to their own context. And so giving historical examples is something that the training would do, something that the activists may lack in that without the kind of capacity building trainings. And finally, there's also an idea that, these are extremely bundled treatments, right? Like a capacity building training that's, for example, a week long or 2 weeks long is something that there's a lot that is thrown at the activists. One thing is, the material that they're learning, but there's also this aspect of socialization that happens when activists get trained. It's really hard to tease apart, what is doing the work in these bundle treatments. But one big thing that we've observed is that as you do trainings, you're actually socializing activists into the campaign, and you're building consensus as you're doing that across demands and tactics. And so building those kind of shared frameworks and socialization is a really big part of trainings that has nothing to do necessarily with the content of what they're learning. So we expect that given these kind of deficiencies or maybe gaps that we've observed, we think that nonviolent action trainings should have an effect on attitudes, ideas, and behaviors of the people who are trained, and in three main areas that we want to outline. So number one is, it should people should gain strategic kind of understanding of how to do this, and so they should have a reduced the number one is more on the choices, on the tactical choices that they make, because even if there are activists that are from not doing nonviolent resistance, sometimes in the heat of the moment they engage in violence. So even the people who we work with, activists on nonviolent activists and peace builders, sometimes when they do a protest, they see that violence is being used either kind of more spontaneously, and but building an understanding of how nonviolent action works, how nonviolent discipline works, and how repression is affected by that, should reduce the willingness of people to engage in violence and should increase support for the use of nonviolent resistance. The second is that we should observe changes in organizational practices. So not just ideas about whether they should use be disciplined with nonviolent resistance, but in addition to that, we should see that if you train leaders, right, leaders of these campaigns to use kind of conflict analysis and strategic analysis tools, that they should be implementing them in their own organizations and changing the practices of how they do things. So for example, before they do an action, they should have a period of time of planning and strategic analysis. And then actually post event, they should have a kind of a learning lessons learned reflection moment related to the camp, to the move, to the action. The third thing is that we should observe that movement composition and unity should change. And this is the reason is that we emphasize a lot that for nonviolent resistance to be effective, there needs to be cross-sectoral alliances. So not just that the more number of people that you mobilize, the better, but you gain more power by mobilizing different sectors of society. So not just students, for example, mobilizing, but students with professionals, with unions, with religious and faith-based organizations. So the more sectorally kind of diverse the movement is, the more likely it is to succeed. And so if they gained that understanding of how nonviolent action works, then we should see at least an effort from the activist leaders that get trained to build more unity within the movement and increase the number of alliances that they have of different types of groups. So those are the three main areas where we expect to see changes. Now, to explain, kind of getting to the research design and data collection, we conducted this study in partnership with the United States Institute of Peace, and specifically within the Nonviolent Action Program at USIP. And the United States Institute of Peace created a guide and a training program called SNAP, Synergizing Nonviolent Action and Peace Building. And this training program is a 1 week long training. The guide is freely available in multiple languages. It was created by Nadine Block and Lisa Church. And through the USIP gets funding from the State Department. So the State Department gave funding to do these trainings in 4 countries, in Nicaragua, Venezuela, Tunisia, and Sudan. So we didn't get to choose those countries. The U.S. Institute of Peace, kind of the Nonviolent Action Program, alongside a DRL, the State Department, came together to decide these countries. And we gained funding to train hundreds of activists, and in some places more than 1,000 activists in these countries. Now, we followed a very kind of extremely involved and invested a lot of time in developing teams in all these 4 places and in co-creating everything. So even though there is kind of overall the SNAP program is one treatment, as I mentioned, it is a very bundled treatment, and I'll describe a little bit of what SNAP is. But importantly, the activists and the community leaders and the trainers in all these 4 places contextualize the training to their own setting. And of course, we also trained them on the research methods, and we collaboratively developed the survey together. We adapted the survey questions to each context, and added added components of the research design alongside them, as well as we developed the randomizations, the research design and the way that we would randomize in each country alongside the trainers that we worked with. So SNAP, just to summarize what the training is, it is a 1 week long kind of in-person training, full 5 days, and it has 2 main areas. One is teaching students about or activists about nonviolent resistance, the more contentious politics, teaching them also about the peace building side, dialogue, negotiation, mediation, and conflict transformation, and then providing them with strategic planning tools and conflict analysis tools that merge the two, that get them to understand under what conditions you should use kind of more contentious tactics that build power, and under what conditions you should be doing more peace building style tactics, such as dialogue, mediation, and negotiation. So that's what the training is about. And just to tell you a little bit about the research design process that we went over with each country. We first, for every country, we mapped civil society actors and movements by basically going into the country and getting, so USIP usually has either an office in these countries or has people through the embassy, through the US Embassy, and through NGOs and international NGOs that have worked with in the past with USIP. And so we start with those contacts, and then we snowball to be able to understand, kind of map out civil society and make sure that we're not training just one sector of civil society or prioritizing one type of group. And then by scoping, having the scoping trip to the country, we try to have a preview of who will be our facilitators, our trainers, And so then we do like a facilitator selection process where depending on how close the society is, we publicly advertise, the facilitator selection process, or we do it through just snowball sampling of trusted networks. And we choose the facilitators or the trainers based on where they're from. Kind of, we want to have as much diversity as possible in terms of geography, as well as where they're situated in civil society. So some people might be from unions and students and professional associations, faith-based organizations, in some cases even political parties, but we try to not do political parties just to avoid kind of the political side. We focus on movements that are for democracy, for human rights, and anti-corruption, rather than obviously political campaigns. And then we do a training of trainers with those selected facilitators. So we train them in SNAP, right, in the whole training, but then we have them practice doing the trainings. And so that's kind of a 2 or 3 week process with the facilitators. And then we go into the consultation process with the facilitators to understand, how they see the randomization happening in their own countries, whether we do it at the geographic level. If it's at the geographic level, what is a good geographic unit? If the district is too small, the state is too big, and we wouldn't have enough sample size, all those kinds of things we discuss with each group of trainers. And then we develop the surveys with them and do the replication workshops. So the trainers basically choose, they basically choose the places where they want to train, where we think we should be doing the program overall, right? So for example, in one country, it might be, I'll go into each country in a minute, but basically they can decide we're going to train 14 out of the 20 states, because the other states there's too much violence, or it's very difficult to get in, or something like that. Then after we do that selection, then we see where we have contacts. So the idea of the facilitators representing the geographic diversity and also the civil society diversity is really important here, because when we go into a state, we're going to ask the facilitators that are from that state to build up the kind of the people, the participants who are going to be part of the trainings. And the reason that we do this in most cases is because of, it's dangerous and not safe to advertise these programs publicly. The only place where we do that is Tunisia. The other three places we do it through just the networks of the facilitators and their networks, and snowball from there to create each group of participants in each locality. Feel free to interrupt me if something is unclear as I'm going through this. But basically, and also, I just want to confirm, Robert, do I have about 40 minutes, or how long do I have?
It's really up to you.
Okay. How much do we have time overall? When does the workshop end?
In 37 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
So 1 p.m. Eastern
1
time.
p.m. Eastern. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So just to go the overview of the research design for each of the 4 countries. In Nicaragua is the randomized control trial that we started with in 2019. Unfortunately, we got a lot of delays because of COVID, and we even attempted to change the type of training to an online training, which is very difficult because it is an in-person 5-day experiential learning process, and converting that into online was really difficult, but we did that. But then in 2021, we had to stop completely and close the project in Nicaragua because of repression. But we did train up to that moment 340 community leaders in Nicaragua. The randomization process that we went through there is we did it overall at the municipality level, but we grouped certain municipalities that were too small, and where the trainers were saying things like, well, activists just cross these districts easily and no one knows really the distinction between those. And so we wanted to group 2 or 3 districts in some cases. So we did that whole process by surveying the trainers and asking them, okay, which municipalities would you combine? And then after we had those geographic units, then we randomized the sequence in which each geographic unit would get the SNAP training. The reason is that we didn't have enough sample size to do it just a treatment and control group. right? And so what we do is just a step wedge design. So we randomize the order in which each geographic unit will receive the training. So if this geographic unit one, which is composed of three districts, is the number one that we're training, then the all the facilitators who know people in those areas go out to those communities, try to build an attend, uh, the attendance list or the participant list, and then organize the actual in-person training, and do the training. And then we go to the second locality, right? That's how it worked. In Venezuela, it's also a step wedge design, but it's at the state level. It was not at the district or a group of district level. And what we do here is that we ask the facilitators to, and this is for various reasons that I can go into if you'd like, but basically the trainers said that we needed to do at the state level. And of course, there are not enough states to do to have a large enough sample size, not even with the step wedge design. So what we did was we asked them how many trainings they wanted to do in each state. And after saying the number of trainings, so for example, Aragua, the state of Aragua will receive 5 trainings, and then Distrito Federal will receive 10 trainings, right? That's not randomly assigned, the number of trainings, so the dosage of the treatment is not randomly assigned, but the order in which each workshop was done is randomly assigned. And so it's a more complicated step wedge design in Venezuela, but that's what we had to do for that country. We also have we trained there a lot more people. We didn't have to stop because of repression, although that is a pretty closed society as well. But we managed to do it before the last wave of repression that happened after the elections. We've trained about 1,400 community leaders. In Sudan, we did the training this one is not step wedge design. What we did was the trainers told us that we could do it at the district level, at the municipality level. It's a far bigger country, Sudan, and also we focus because of the trainers' emphasis that Sudan has received a lot of attention in Khartoum, like in the capital city, from international NGOs and the international community. So lots of capacity building trainings and investment there, but very, very little outside of Khartoum. And especially, Darfur area, Blue Nile, all these other states that are very large, but they're very rural, and difficult to access. So what we did was we prioritized the difficult to reach places in Sudan. And these are municipalities that are large and more sparse. And so we were able to just do it at the municipality level. And what we do is we select 96 municipalities where the trainer said, okay, the trainings would be viable in person, given security situation and everything. And then what we did was we gathered data on pretreatment covariates, like development scores based on nightlight from each locality. And from ACLED, we gathered protest data and repression data. And so we used this pretreatment covariates to match these 96 to find matches, right? And then we randomly assign which one of the pair would be treated, right? And so we have a treatment and control, but it was matched pairs, which is really nice because it increases our precision by doing the matching prior to randomization. And we trained 1,800 community leaders across 96 municipalities in that locality. And then in Tunisia, the randomization is different. It's actually the only country where we do it at the individual level, and it was publicly recruited. So we put out through various area websites, advertise the SNAP training, and we got more than 2,000 applications from people from the whole country. And we randomly assigned. We had a treatment and a control group at the individual level, and we trained the treatment group. For ethical reasons, in all of these places, we actually also trained the control group later, about half a year later, when we've already done all the measurement, because we don't, just ethically, we didn't think that the control group was just going to just take a survey and kind of leave. We wanted to also give them the opportunity to take the training. And we trained 375 community leaders in Tunisia. All right, so in terms of the sources of data that we gathered surveys, the baseline and the end-line survey for the treatment group. We also gathered a baseline survey for the control group. And in some cases, we gathered a follow-up survey 8 to 12 months after the workshop. In some cases, we couldn't gather this for lack of resources in some places. But for example, in Sudan, we weren't able to do it because of the outbreak of the war. We were doing the follow-up survey as the war started, and so we had to stop. In Venezuela, we have some of the follow-up survey. In Nicaragua, we obviously couldn't. We couldn't even finish the program. And in Tunisia, we do have some follow-up surveys. And then we also have event data sets where we would like to measure kind of macro level effects if we see changes in protests, numbers, in nonviolent discipline, in state repression. Because one unintended effect that these trainings could have is that, yes, it could be build the capacity of a movement, but it could also lead to more repression. And so we wanted to measure state repression through various event data sets. The hardest thing to measure with these event data sets are the more peace building tactics, because we don't have a lot of records from newspapers or from social media and things like that of negotiations and dialogues that movements do. Usually, that's all censored, and what we observe is contentious politics. We observe protests, especially large ones and especially violent ones. And so we try to do some other things I'll tell you in a second to get at more of the peace building ones. Obviously, the survey helps, but so we have different data sets for each country. In Nicaragua, we have this amazing data set that scholar Sergio Cabrales built for his purposes, but he's a co-author in anything having to do with Nicaragua in this project because he built an event data set using 4 newspapers, hand-coded, has a ton of data, including the peace building side and the contentious politics. For Venezuela, we tried many, many other things, but we were using ACLED to get at the event data set for Venezuela. And we think that it's pretty good, ACLED, for the period of time that we're looking at, the more recent time in history. I think if we go back in history, ACLED is not very good, but for the current stuff, I think is quite good. In fact, we surveyed our trainers in Venezuela and asked them to list all the sources of information that they use to know what's happening in their communities. And then we checked what ACLED uses, and there's incredible overlap between the two sources. So the two sets of sources. So we think that ACLED in Venezuela during this period is quite good. In Sudan, because of the incredible difficulty of, these are hard to reach places, extremely rural areas, villages that don't even have electricity sometimes. What we did was we built a network of citizen journalists that we established in the treatment and the control group municipalities. And of course, the citizen journalist doesn't know if they're in a treatment or a control municipality. And then we survey them. We call them up every month and have them fill out a survey asking them for any events, both on peace building side and on contentious politics and state repression that they observe in their communities. And so we basically gathered an event data set in Sudan. And then in Tunisia, we're still looking at what we'll use, either ACLED or Christopher Barry's data that's also on protest. The third source of data that we use in this study is social media, although this one has been deprioritized enormously given the changes that we've seen from Twitter to X. The API, academic API, doesn't work anymore very well, even paying enormous amounts of money. I mean, at least $100,000 for some of the data. We don't think it's reliable, so we have not done that. And so we did gather a lot of the data pre-Elon Musk for Tunisia, and so Tunisia will be able to analyze. Maybe Venezuela, because there are some scholars that I'm talking to that have some of that data that they scraped before Elon Musk. But other than that, and obviously Sudan, I think social media was out even prior to this because again, these are communities that don't even have electricity sometimes, so they don't use social media. But I was particularly excited with Venezuela because Venezuelans use social media a lot, especially X. But it's looking like it'll be difficult. And then, of course, we have interviews, long, lengthy, kind of semi-structured interviews with the participants from SNAP, focusing mainly on the surveys in this because of the workshop. This is just what some of the workshops might look like. So some of them were virtual in Venezuela particularly, but most of the countries and in most of the workshops, it was in person. So just to give you a sense of the pictures. So just getting very quickly into meta-analysis, I think Robert wanted me to just describe a little bit of what a meta-analysis would do and what it is. And this is what I've been doing in the past few months to try to understand. It's my first meta-analysis that I would do to try to understand what it is and how it's done, And so just wanted to share a couple of things. So one is, you have these studies, these four different countries, four different, very different settings in terms of context, level of authoritarianism, type of regime, history of conflict, armed conflict, and also history of instability and coups. And so but we have kind of overall the same treatment, even though there are differences because of the contextualization. I can talk about what remains the same, the core of what we're teaching. And so it's the same treatment across four different, very different settings. And we thought that it's an enormously important opportunity to kind of merge that understanding across cases and try to see some comparative understanding that we could develop. We also very nicely have the survey that is pretty much the same across the board. There are some differences that we contextualize with the trainers, and I can talk about some of those differences, but overall, they're very, very similar measures that we use across the four contexts. And so this lends itself so nicely for a meta-analysis. We have separate papers for Sudan and Venezuela that are the ones that were able to develop the most and did more rigorously. And but we want to write a book that is the meta-analysis of all these cases and include a lot of the qualitative evidence that we haven't been able to include in the papers and that we have. So the Sudan paper is conditionally accepted at Nature Human Behavior, and then the Venezuela paper we're submitting soon, by the end of the year. But we want to write a book about this and include all the qualitative stuff and also get into the ethics of all of this. I mean, what it is to co-create with communities. I mean, all these things that really a book would only be able to get at. And so the goal is to combine results from multiple studies and kind of assess the generalizability of the findings. The idea is that there's kind of some common mechanisms that are applicable because of the common treatment. And then, but it importantly requires kind of harmonization across the different measures. And the comparison needs to be right between the treatment and the control. And then the outcomes have to be measured as similarly as possible. And then this provides a lot of more external validity, right? And to collect all these studies. And then we would like to have, the specifics of this is basically that we would be able to analyze ATEs, right? Average treatment effects, and be able to see the size across the different cases and kind of and weigh, right, by the position of the different estimates. And to be able to distinguish between the different countries, we would do a random effects model to capture that heterogeneity. And then we would provide kind of forest plots to summarize the specific kind of overall estimates, and then we would have variance for each of those. I'm going to go through this real quick and just wanted to get into the kind of the survey, the construct of the surveys across the four countries to give you a sense of how similar they are and whether, we'll be comparing them. So first, we wanted to see the attitudes towards nonviolent resistance. So an example of a survey question might be, the opposition must keep the option of using violence, and kind of how much do you agree with this? You disagree or agree? So it's a 5-point Likert scale. We also ask if people think that protest is an obstacle to negotiation. So this gets at kind of merging protest and negotiation to see if people get a better understanding of how the two work together or if they're in contradiction. We also try to get at people's thoughts on the effectiveness of nonviolence. We ask things like, how successful has peaceful protest been worldwide? Also a 5-point Likert scale. Also, we ask about which has been more effective historically, armed or civic struggle. We also ask specifically about, this was debated enormously with our trainers to not ask survey questions that would be too sensitive or would put people at risk. And so I can talk about how we did that. But basically, the ones on the use of violence or nonviolence, we ask, how willing are you to use extreme protest tactics or disruptive tactics, trying to get at the use of violence? And then we ask them to say, qualitatively, what do you mean? What do you think? What do you think of when you say extreme tactic or disruptive tactic? Most people do get that it is violence, and so that's nice, but that's how we framed it in some cases. In other cases, we asked the question of how much would you support a a proponent of your movement using violence? So not that you would use violence, right? But how much would you support others in your movement using violence? And so those are the two ways that we use the violence question. I'm going to skip the scenarios and justice preference. It's quite complicated. We also asked efficacy questions, so individual and group efficacy. This comes from psychology, and there's batteries of tests that ask about people's overall sense of self-efficacy and group efficacy. And these are actually things that are hard to move, and that's what we actually see in the survey results, that a training does not really move levels of self-efficacy and group efficacy. However, we do see a lot of movement in the confidence of using self-efficacy, but in more domain-specific efficacy that has to do with nonviolent resistance. So we ask, how confident are you in using strategic planning tool X, Y, and Z? How confident are you in using dialogue with your opponents and things like that? So we ask a bunch of different questions related to like domain-specific confidence, and those increase dramatically after SNAP, but not so much the general self-efficacy. Then we ask questions about behavioral changes. So this is comparing the baseline survey with the follow-up survey, right? Not the immediately after the workshop, where we wouldn't expect people to have petitioned during that week of workshop. And so we ask, kinds of how much have you participated in the last 12 months? How many times have you petitioned? Have you protested? Have you recruited others? Sit-ins, dialogues, negotiation, etc. We also asked knowledge questions. We wanted to get at and see if actual knowledge was increased on just objective definitions and things like that. And that's it in terms of the survey and the comparisons across all the countries. I have about 20 minutes left, and I don't yet have, unfortunately, an actual meta-analysis of all these surveys. I haven't had time to do that, and so I wanted to give you a preview of. I can give you a sense of what I find in Venezuela and tell you what I find in the other places that is consistent very quickly, and then we can have a discussion. So in Venezuela, we see a dramatic increase in the understanding that nonviolent action is effective and that it's been successful globally. And we see a reduction in the willingness to use violence. This is actually across all countries. This is what we observe. Basically, the same type of we see a systematic decrease in the willingness to use violence. However, it's measured across the 4 countries, and we see an increase in the attitudes towards whether nonviolent action could be effective against repressive regimes, and also just the historical understanding that it's been successful globally. We see a reduction in the idea that change is impossible if elites hold all the power. And so this is an interesting question that we ask in the survey that we wanted to get at with Venezuelans, but we get at with all the countries. And the reason is that Venezuelans, when we started doing the work there, were like, well, we've been doing protests for the past 2 decades, so we don't think that this works. And that's how we started. That was the baseline for most people in Venezuela. And so we wanted to see if SNAP really changed those perceptions. And there is a huge decrease in the percentage of people who say that change is impossible from nonviolent resistance if elites hold all the power. So that says that people did change from like helplessness and hopelessness to actually seeing it differently. Then we also see changes in the people thinking that negotiations cannot address root causes. So we see a reduction in this idea, as well as a reduction in that protests are an obstacle to negotiation, although this is on the edge of significance. In terms of the other countries, this is the most dramatic change in Venezuela is the most dramatic change. Actually, in some places, like it's more similar to this. It's like closer to the level of significance. So in Venezuela is the place where we see the most change here in the elites hold all the power. This is showing the null effects for the general self-efficacy and group efficacy, and this is across the 4 countries. We just don't move people. And this actually makes sense now that I've read a little more on the psychology literature, that these are things that are created, like these are innate things that are very hard to move, that are moved by things that happen in your childhood, personality things. Maybe some major events could change this, but definitely not something very movable. But then we see a dramatic increase across all the domain-specific kind of confidence levels. And this is in the 4 countries. We see it across the board. People feel more confident in conflict analysis, strategic planning, doing the synergy of nonviolent action and peace building, in developing a vision and a mission for their campaigns, in doing dialogue within their organization, dialogue with allies, and dialogues with those who you disagree with. And so that's it for now. Stay tuned for the whole meta-analysis. And any feedback would be wonderful because as we're developing this, I would just love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Consuelo. Very insightful talk. Very impressive work too. And yeah, let's open the floor for questions. Uh, Berlihan?
Hi, yeah, my name is Bedirhan. Thank you for the presentation. It was interesting for me. I mostly work on the Tunisian case and not on activism, but broadly. So I had one thing I thought about was you mentioned X. X is very rarely used in Tunisia, and the people who use X tend to be people who are connected to international networks. So to be actually like
Facebook, right, is what they use more.
Facebook, yeah,
Yeah, we
Facebook.
gather Facebook too. Yeah, for
Yeah, and then the secondary thing would be Instagram. I wasn't sure if you, yeah, I just wanted to mention it. So looking at X would give you almost nothing probably in Tunisia, I would say. And then also I had a question about like the results about like the effects on the actual increase in protests. Do you have any results on that yet
the
or
event
not?
data sets, yes.
Yes, okay.
So, looking at the event data sets, we have results that we're confident in Venezuela and in Sudan, not yet the other two countries. In Sudan, we don't see, we actually, from the whole event data set analysis, we see one major change, which is a reduction in state repression in Sudan. So we see that the places comparing the control group municipalities with the treated municipalities, we see after SNAP less state repression. And from the interviews, we can glean why that is happening. The interviews tell us that people started using, before they planned an action and actually carried it out locally, they would go to their local kind of officials and trusted leaders in the community and talk to them about what they were planning to do. So using the dialogue and the mediation skills that we try to instill in them to try to prevent kind of misunderstandings of what the action was about, we think that that reduced the level of perceived threat from the state. So that's what happened in Sudan. However, in Venezuela, we unfortunately find that repression increased slightly after SNAP. And so our pre-register analysis, like our pre-analysis plan, had predicted that we would find a null result in repression, state repression, because you can increase the capacity of activists and that should increase repression. But then you're increasing the probability that they use nonviolent discipline and that should decrease repression. So it should be a net effect of zero. But we said that if one is more operative than the other, then of course we would see an increase or a decrease in repression, right? So like if they do a lot more nonviolent discipline, than kind of capacity building, then we should see a reduction in repression if they, right? But what we find in Venezuela is that from the interviews, we've determined that they tried to do what the Sudanese did in terms of negotiating with local authorities, but in Venezuela, the armed actors are so fractured. Like no one even knows who would come to repress a particular protest. The activists just don't. There are armed groups everywhere. There are multiple, National Guard, military, police, different types of police, right? The secret police, like there's just very different types of armed actors. I hadn't thought of how that fracture, of course the literature shows that is really difficult to manage those contexts, but we have a lot more to think about depending on the context of state repression. SNAP might have very different effects on state repression. And in terms of the number of protests, we do see a positive effect across Sudan and Tunisia in terms of the number of peaceful protests that happen, but those are not statistically significant. They're right on the edge. If it is 90% confidence intervals, yes, you see an increase, but not at the 95% confidence, which is the pre-register, the PAP. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Yeah,
Thank
thank
you
you
so much.
again for joining.
Yeah, sorry about mentioning X with Tunisia. You're completely right. I forgot to put that is for Tunisia, it's Facebook, and for Venezuela, it's X. That is the most common. Sorry.
Joseph.
First of all, very good presentation, and you have a lot of data to go through. So good
Mhm.
job. You did a good job. And I would love to read the paper once it
And
comes
share the
out.
Venezuela and the Sudan. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. I have a question about sampling. So do you know how USIP picks their participants? I was wondering because could it be that they're already less likely to use violence than other activists in protests who might not be included in these workshops and are sort of screened out, or just that USIP does not have any kind of connection to them. And not to, I mean, this is really hard to do, and what you're doing is already great. I'm just wondering if you have any information on that.
Definitely. That's a wonderful question, Joseph. So I do have a lot of insights on how we picked it because that was part of the whole process with the participants and with the trainers. So couple things I'll say about that. Number one, definitely we trained activists and peace builders, right? So we did not train like armed rebels, right? To bring them to over to nonviolent resistance, right? So there's a big distinction there. Um, we were concerned that we would have ceiling effects, like what you're saying, that like if you already believe in nonviolent resistance, how more can we like move you, right? And in fact, we do see a little bit of variation there because of the ceiling effects. So people in Tunisia far more likely to say that they do nonviolent resistance and that they want just to do nonviolent resistance and be nonviolent disciplined than Nicaraguans. I would say Nicaraguans were the least likely. We trained a lot of activists in Nicaragua from rural areas that have actually lived through civil war and are tied to campesino movements that are still armed. And so they were less drastic about distinguishing themselves from those kinds of people. And so we moved Nicaraguans far more after SNAP because of those ceiling effects were not as applicable. And on how they recruited participants, so it was through the networks and snowball sampling from the networks of our very trainers. And so those are communities that are embedded throughout the country that are already doing nonviolent resistance. However, in almost in every nonviolent movement that you look at, there are, people who use violence in some ways during protests, especially when there's repression, right? So like throwing rocks or Molotov cocktails at the police and things like that. And so we wanted to see if there was a change in understanding of how important it is to be nonviolently disciplined because of the consequence of repression that comes after using violence, even if it's not like armed resistance, like with weapons and organizing in the forest or in the jungle, right? But even like a nonviolent action activist could see the justification for throwing a Molotov cocktail at the police that's like hurting them, right? And so there is some room for change as well within that community.
Yeah, very interesting to see that intra-case variation. And like you
Right.
said, if you do link it to the particular group or coalitions linked to armed resistance in the past, that's very interesting.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the campesino movement areas, we could even look at like although we might not have like a huge sample size, but the
Right.
interviews are revealing really interesting stuff there for sure.
Because my thinking was obviously they're not going to have like people from like colectivos in Venezuela, like
Yeah, no.
people who do go to protest, but they go in favor of the regime and they usually use violence. Like, but yeah, it's hard to do.
So
It's hard
that's a
to
good
do.
one that you mentioned Venezuela, because Venezuela, we actually did not get close to the colectivo population because of how dangerous that would be. So in a highly repressive place like Venezuela today, and actually Nicaragua today is very repressive, but it wasn't as bad when we were doing the work. And we did not want to put anyone at risk. We were doing these programs in secrecy, like meaning that the Maduro government obviously didn't know that we were training people on the ground. And so we didn't want anyone from the colectivos or people who might support Maduro to find out that we were doing the training because that would put everyone at risk. And so we definitely did not train those kinds of people who were supporters of the Maduro regime.
Makes sense. Thank you. Good
Mhm.
work.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We have some time. Well, in that case, I will go ahead. So, Consuelo, I'm mostly interested in the Nicaragua case,
Yeah.
and you said there are some nice effects there of the training.
Yeah.
So, I was wondering, what are those effects in that outcome about the changes possible?
Oh, yeah. hmm So we do see a change in people do see that do think after SNAP in the treatment areas compared to the control group areas that they do have the power through nonviolent resistance to change things even when the elites hold all the power. However, the effects are substantively larger in Venezuela than in Nicaragua.
Hmm.
Yeah, but we do see change there in that survey question as well. A
Nice.
statistically significant change. Yeah. That was an interesting case too. Nicaraguans, in their lifetimes, the people that we were training and things like that, like they've seen mass protests, the 2018 movement, but then they've been around for armed action as well, on rebellion and civil war. And so in some cases, some people were very young, but so that presents a really interesting case where people have seen both and kind of um, I think that the key thing is that SNAP teaches people about the range of nonviolent action tactics and also combining them strategically with peace building, that people who've been using protest are just doing protest, and they don't see the wide array of tactics and ways of building power that a training gives you. And so I think that that's what we're seeing, that reduction in perception, that elites hold all the power and we can't do anything about it, because even if people have been really hard at work trying to change things through nonviolent action, they've been narrowly focused on protest, which is what most people do.
Right. Yeah. No, yeah, this is fantastic work. Very impressive. Well, so lastly, I would like to invite everyone to our next and final workshop of the semester, which will take place November 5th at our usual time. And we will have Shannon Warren from Innovations for Poverty Action. And her talk title is Representativeness Across Four Remote Survey Modes in 9 Low and Middle Income Countries. So stay tuned. We'll send the email reminder to our list, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you,
Thank you so
Consuelo.
much, everyone.